It started on an autumn night in Newport when the house smelled like old wood, expensive wine, and something colder than air. The dining room stretched like a stage, long and polished with its chandeliers catching every flicker of the firelight from the marble fireplace where my mother liked to sit like a queen. I had grown up in this house in these perfect rooms where silence had more weight than words. That night, I sat across from Douglas Kane, my stepfather, while my mother, Vivian Steele, crossed her legs by the fire, swirling red wine in a crystal glass. I remember how she did not look at me, not really only watched my reflection on the glass door behind me. That was the way she controlled me, quietly, without moving. I had not meant to say it. The words slipped out during dinner, a single sentence. My grandfather left me the inheritance. All of it. $50 million. I could hear the click of the clock on the wall stop for a breath. Douglas's face hardened, the line between his brows cut deep like an old scar. He did not say anything for a few seconds. But the silence stretched and something shifted. The air got tighter. I knew what silence meant in this house. I had learned it since I was 6. Silence meant danger was walking toward me. I pushed my chair back a little, trying to pretend it was nothing. But Vivian leaned back, the firelight painting her cheekbones in gold, the corner of her mouth lifting into that small, cruel smile that always meant she had decided something before anyone else could. Douglas's chair scraped against the oak floor, loud like a blade against bone. He stood up slowly, one hand on the edge of the table. He did not shout. He never did. That made it worse. His calm always came before the storm. I whispered no without sound. His eyes found mine like hooks. He moved around the table, each step measured, deliberate. The way a hunter closes the distance to something that cannot run fast enough. I stepped back until my spine met the wall. The painting of my great-grandfather hung above me, judging from another century. Douglas opened the drawer of the antique sideboard next to him. He knew exactly where it was, a silver roll of duct tape. It had been there for years. I had walked past that drawer 100 times without really seeing it. Tonight it gleamed under the chandelier. I felt the cold of the wall behind my back. My heart slammed so hard it filled my ears with its rhythm. Vivian's voice floated from the fireplace. "If she talks again, shut him up." The way she said it was soft, like asking for more wine. That softness made everything sharper. Douglas raised his hand. His fingers caught my arm before I could slip sideways. He was always stronger. That was the truth no one wanted to say out loud. The duct tape unrolled with that sound. That dry, ripping sound that always means something is about to be taken from someone. My mouth, my breath, my choice. I tried to twist away, but the table corner caught my hip. He pressed the tape over my mouth. The adhesive bit into my skin. The chandelier above trembled slightly from the force with which he pinned me. I could taste the chemical tang. I could feel the heat of his breath so close it felt like a prison built around my face. He whispered close to my ear that talking cost too much in this family. I stared past him at Vivian. She was sitting like marble, perfect posture. No reaction. Her eyes glimmered not with pity, but with something else. Satisfaction. The room closed in. The fire snapped behind her. The sound of the tape rolling echoed louder than the world. I tried to breathe through my nose, sharp, shallow breaths. My body shook not because I was weak, but because I was terrified of the quiet. The chandelier's light fractured into shards around me. Douglas's voice cut through the air again, low and smooth. "You should have kept quiet, Mara. That money is not yours. That's family money." The word family landed like a weapon. I tried to scream, but the tape held. The sound died in my throat. The only thing I could do was stare. At the fire. At the crystal glass. At the way my mother took another sip of wine like this was nothing more than another night in Newport. The smell of the duct tape mixed with her perfume and the old house. I wanted to believe someone would walk through that door. I wanted to believe someone would see. But no one came. My father's portrait above me seemed to lean closer, but that was just my breath catching. Douglas held me in place for a moment longer, then stepped back like a man satisfied with a chore done right. My hands shook at my sides. He tossed the tape onto the sideboard like it was a tool, not a weapon. Vivian's voice slid across the room again. Finally quiet. The words sliced me cleaner than the tape ever could. I stood there against the wall, mouth sealed, heart hammering, knowing nothing in this house was ever an accident. In that silence, I felt the full weight of what I had just said. $50 million. My voice was worth exactly that, and they had decided it was too expensive. If you have ever felt a silence pressed against your face, like a hand, you will understand the moment I stopped being their daughter and became their enemy. This was not just about inheritance anymore. It was about control. That was the night I understood how far they would go to keep it. If you have ever lived through a silence like this, you already know the air stops moving long before the scream dies. If you know that feeling, leave a single dot in the comments. It is how I will know you understand what it means to be trapped in a house full of chandeliers and no light at all. When I was 6 years old, the house on the hill overlooking Newport Harbor looked like something out of a painting. Ivy crawled up the white stone walls, the flag flapped lazily in the ocean breeze, and polished windows caught the light like mirrors. People in town said it was beautiful. I remember thinking it was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that lives inside walls. My mother, Vivian Steele, liked everything to look perfect. She believed perfection was a shield, not just against gossip, but against the truth. She had a rule that good girls were seen, not heard. She said it so many times it stopped sounding like words and became air itself. I learned to move like a shadow. I learned not to cough too loud in the grand hallway with the portraits of ancestors staring down in their stiff suits. My room overlooked the water, but the window only opened 3 inches. She said it was for my safety. I knew it was to keep me contained. At that age, I used to press my face against the glass and imagine the wind could carry me somewhere else, somewhere where people laughed without looking over their shoulders. At night, when the waves hit the rocks below the hill, I imagined it was the sound of a train I could board and leave. But in the mornings, there was always breakfast at the long table. Vivian never wore pajamas. She wore silk robes with pearl buttons and hair pinned back like a woman expecting cameras. She corrected my posture before she let me touch my spoon. She corrected my speech when I tried to tell her about the seagulls. One morning, I said I wanted to play outside, and she smiled a perfect smile. She said little girls with steel blood did not run around. They hosted, they attended, they represented. I was 6 and already learning how to disappear behind a smile. I used to watch the way her hands moved when she talked. Smooth, precise. I understood that to be loved here, I needed to become that. Smooth, precise, silent. When I turned 8, I stopped asking questions. I started copying. I copied how she sat, how she folded her hands on the table, how she tilted her head when someone important spoke. She told me silence was elegant. She said women who talk too much ruin everything for themselves. She said my real father talked too much. She said it without blinking. At that time, I did not understand why her eyes always turned glassy when she spoke about him. Later, I would understand. He was the only thing she could not control, and he had left. I became the thing she could. By 12, the house no longer felt like a house. It felt like a script I was forced to read over and over. Every friend I made, she investigated. Every school trip she approved. Every dress she selected. She said it was because she loved me. She said good mothers protect their daughters from making mistakes. I wanted to believe that was true. It was easier to survive when you believed the cage was for your own good. That was the year Douglas Kane appeared. He came to a summer party in a dark suit, even though the air was warm and heavy with salt. He laughed too loud, but his eyes moved over everything, like someone measuring the value of furniture. My mother laughed differently around him. Not soft, but sharp, like she was showing him her teeth. I sat at the end of the garden table with a lemonade while the adults drank champagne and pretended the ocean view made them better people. Douglas leaned down and said something about how quiet I was. He said, "Quiet girls grow up to be good women." I did not understand the chill that ran through me then, but I remember it. It stayed. A year later, they were married on the same lawn with the white chairs lined in perfect rows. My mother's smile in the photographs was perfect. My smile was something else. It was what happens when a child realizes no one is coming to change the story. Douglas moved into the house like he had always been there. He learned the rhythms of the place fast. He learned when my mother gave orders with her eyes. He learned that I obeyed before anyone had to speak. He liked that. I saw it in the way his mouth twitched when I lowered my gaze. Vivian said he was good for the family. She said he made things stable. Stability was her favorite word, but stability in that house meant her voice and his hand on every door. At 15, I had wanted to apply to a boarding school in New Hampshire. I had filled out the forms secretly at night under the dim light of a lamp that buzzed like a trapped insect. The next morning, she handed me the same forms already torn in half. She said daughters of this family did not run away to chase fantasies. She said my place was here. A year later, I applied to Harvard University. I never sent the application because Vivian said no before I even printed it. She had already decided I would study business at the local college. I watched my future shrink one conversation at a time. Every time she said no, she smiled like she was giving me a gift. Douglas nodded behind her like a shadow echo. When I think back now, it was not one moment that broke me. It was the slow drip of control until my own voice disappeared. People on the outside saw a house on the hill and said I was lucky. Inside, I knew luck had a cost. I carried it in my silence. I wore it like a second skin. It was the reason that night at the dining table years later the tape across my mouth felt familiar. It was not the first time they had taken my voice. It was just the first time they had done it out loud. When I stepped out of the train station in Newport after 3 days in New York, the air felt colder than when I had left. The kind of cold that lives inside the wind, thin and sharp. I had spent those days signing papers with a lawyer in a quiet office with tall glass windows. I still remember how the ink bled into the trust documents like something final had been written. I had done it alone. I had not told Vivian. I had not told Douglas. For the first time in my life, I had made a decision that belonged to me. I thought about that as the taxi rolled down Bellevue Avenue past the mansions that always looked like they were watching each other. My grandfather's house stood at the end of the street like it always had. Too big, too quiet, too perfect. The iron gates opened when the driver pressed the intercom. Douglas always said the house recognized family. I pressed my hand against the leather seat to stop it from shaking. I told myself it was just another dinner. It was never just another dinner in this house. The dining room light was already on when I stepped inside. Vivian was sitting at the table with a file folder open in front of her. She never did anything by accident. If she was waiting like that, it meant she already knew something. She had always been 3 steps ahead of me. Douglas was pouring himself a drink at the sideboard. He turned and smiled that smile that was not a smile. He said, "New York made me look tired." I told him I was fine. Vivian closed the folder slowly and said we should have dinner together like a family. The way she said family always sounded like a lock clicking. I sat down across from her. The silverware was aligned perfectly. The fire in the fireplace burned steady. I watched the flames because I could not look at their faces too long. Douglas asked what I had been doing in the city. I said work meetings. He asked again, this time softer, like a snake coiling. I said nothing else. Vivian sipped her wine without blinking. The silence grew teeth. I had always been good at hiding things, but I had never hidden something this big. $50 million sat in a trust with my name on it, and only I had the keys now. They did not know that yet. Or maybe they did. The thought made my throat tight. Vivian leaned forward and asked if I remembered the trust conditions. She said it lightly, like she was talking about the weather. I nodded. She said it would be released on my 26th birthday. I nodded again. She smiled without warmth and said that was good because Douglas had plans to expand the family holdings. She spoke as if the money was already in his hands. Something inside me tightened like a rope. I said it was mine. The words came out small at first, then louder. It's mine. The trust goes to me. Next month. The sound of my own voice surprised me. Douglas set down his glass. The sound of crystal on wood was too loud in that room. Vivian stopped smiling. For a second, no one moved. Then I saw something flicker behind Douglas's eyes. Not surprise. Calculation. He asked me to repeat it. I did. My heartbeat pounded against my ribs like a fist against a door. He asked what I planned to do with it. His tone had changed, no longer polite. Vivian did not say a word. She just watched. She always let him speak first when she wanted something done. I told him I had not decided yet. That was the wrong answer. I saw it in the way his jaw tightened. He said family money should stay with family. He said I was too young to handle that kind of responsibility. I reminded him I was 26, not 12. He said age does not mean experience. Vivian finally spoke. She said trust funds are dangerous when they fall into the wrong hands. She said mine. Her voice was calm and smooth like marble. I asked what wrong hands meant when it was my name on the papers. She smiled again, the same smile she had used when she tore my boarding school application in half years ago. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to shout. Instead, I pressed my nails into the underside of the table until I could feel the wood splintering. Douglas leaned forward with both elbows on the table and said, "Money makes people forget who they belong to." He said we are a family. He said nothing works if everyone starts acting like they own themselves. He said it like it was a sin. I told him I do own myself. For a second, I thought he might laugh. He didn't. He stared at me the way a man looks at something that should have stayed obedient. I saw the moment he decided I was a threat. He did not need to say it. I felt it. Vivian picked up her wine glass and turned it in slow circles. She said I should think carefully about what kind of daughter I want to be. The weight of that sentence pressed against my chest. I could hear the clock ticking on the mantel. Every tick sounded louder. It felt like they were closing in on me without moving their chairs. The walls seemed to shrink. This was their favorite game. They built a cage with words. They wrapped it around me until my voice no longer fit inside. But this time I had already signed the papers. This time the key was mine. My pulse drummed behind my ears. I said again, "It is mine," Vivian said, careful. Douglas tilted his head like someone listening to a tune only he could hear. He smiled that quiet smile again and said, "No, it is ours." That was when I knew the fight was no longer hidden. It had started. It was no longer about the inheritance alone. It was about whether I would stay under their control or not. The air felt heavy and still, like the house itself was holding its breath. I stared at the chandelier above me and wondered if anyone outside could hear the sound of something cracking. It was not wood. It was the last thread holding the illusion of family together. The sound of the clock on the mantel faded under the weight of something heavier. I could feel it before it happened. The way Douglas's shoulders squared and the air in the room thickened like the moment before a storm hits the coast. He leaned back in his chair slowly like a man making a decision he had already rehearsed. Vivian did not look at me. She turned her wine glass a quarter inch to the left and set it down gently. I knew that gesture. It was the silent signal. My pulse quickened in my throat. I said nothing, but my hands were pressed against my knees under the table. Douglas stood up. Not fast. He did not need speed. He had power. His chair scraped against the floor again, that sound like a blade being drawn. I stood up too, but it was too late. He stepped around the table with the same slow patience of someone who knows there is no one to stop him. The chandelier above us swayed a little from the movement of air. My breath caught in my chest. Vivian finally spoke. She said enough. She said it softly, as if announcing the end of a polite dinner. Her calm made everything worse. I stepped back, but the wall was already behind me. Douglas reached into the same drawer where the silver utensils were kept. His hand came out holding the duct tape, the same silver roll I had seen so many times without realizing it was a promise. His eyes did not leave mine. I said his name once, but it came out too small. He did not answer. He stepped closer. The floorboards creaked beneath him. My heart pounded so loud I thought it might drown out everything else. Vivian tilted her head toward the fireplace, her voice smooth and cold. "If she talks again, shut him up." She said it like someone ordering another glass of wine. That softness was the sharpest thing in the room. Douglas reached me in 3 steps. He caught my arm above the elbow and spun me toward the wall. The painting behind me rattled slightly. I twisted to pull free, but his grip only tightened. My breath came in short bursts. I tasted metal, though there was none. The sound of the tape unrolling ripped through the room like a warning. I knew exactly what was about to happen, but knowing did not help. He pressed the tape over my mouth. The chemical smell burned the back of my throat. My lungs squeezed against the weight of my fear. The chandelier's reflection fractured in my eyes. He leaned close and whispered that money had made me forget my place. His voice was calm like always, the calm of someone who believes the house and everything in it already belongs to him. I tried to scream, but it died beneath the tape. My body jerked, but he was stronger. He had always been stronger. My back pressed harder into the wall as he held me there. The tape stuck fast. Vivian exhaled slowly from her chair like someone settling into a comfortable seat at the theater. Douglas stepped back half a pace, his eyes scanning my face as if making sure his work was done right. I stood there, pinned to the wall by silence that was not mine. The tape cut into the corners of my mouth. My pulse thrashed against my ribs like something trapped in a cage. The chandelier trembled again as if it too knew what was happening. Douglas looked at me the way a man looks at something that once belonged to him. Vivian crossed her legs slowly and folded her hands in her lap. She asked if I had learned my lesson yet. She said it without raising her voice. Her calm was worse than shouting. It meant she had already decided I was a problem to be managed. Douglas leaned closer until his breath pressed against my skin. He told me that family money stays with family. He told me I had forgotten that. He tapped his fingers against my cheek where the tape stretched. The touch made my stomach twist. I tried to breathe through my nose, but it came fast and shallow. My wrists shook at my sides. Vivian said enough again, but this time it sounded more like satisfaction than mercy. I knew that tone. She was pleased to see me reduced to silence. It was how she wanted me all along. The door to the kitchen opened for a second, and one of the staff stepped into the doorway. A boy no older than 15 froze when he saw us. His eyes widened. Douglas turned his head slowly, and the boy bolted back through the kitchen like a rabbit. For a heartbeat, there was a flicker of hope in my chest. Someone had seen. Then the realization hit. No one here had ever stopped them before. I was shaking now, not because of the cold, but because the weight of years was pressing down on me at once. This was not just tonight. This was every no, every command, every moment they told me silence was elegance. This was the truth behind all of it. Vivian said, "Look at her, Douglas, she finally understands." My nails dug into my palms until I could feel the sharpness against skin. My breath sounded too loud in my own ears. Douglas leaned back, finally letting go of my arm. I slid down the wall an inch, my legs refusing to steady. He tossed the tape onto the sideboard like it was nothing more than a tool. He smoothed his shirt cuffs. Vivian picked up her glass again and whispered, finally quiet. That whisper dug into me like a knife made of air. I stared at both of them, and for the first time in my life, I did not just feel fear. I felt something else rising beneath it. It was cold and steady, and it burned brighter than panic. It was the first spark of refusal. I could not speak, but I could still look. I stared at Vivian until her smile twitched for half a second. I wanted her to see it, the part of me that she had not crushed. She turned away toward the fire, but I saw it, that small flicker in her eyes. Douglas brushed past me like I was furniture. The room smelled like tape and wine and power. I sank to the floor slowly. The chandelier light shook overhead. In that silence, I made a promise to myself. This would not end here. If you have ever stood in a room where your voice was taken from you, then you know how that silence tastes. If you have ever seen people smile while they steal your breath, then you understand the kind of fury that builds without sound. If you know that feeling, leave a single word in the comments. That is how I will know you understand what it means to be forced quiet. That night, they thought the tape would hold me. They did not see what it really did. It turned silence into a blade that belonged to me. The night after the tape, I did not sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling while the house exhaled its slow, expensive breaths. The chandelier in the hallway cast a fractured shadow across my wall like a net. My lips still burned where the tape had stuck. I had peeled it off in the bathroom, pulling it slowly so no one would hear, watching thin red lines bloom across my skin in the mirror. Vivian had gone to bed early. Douglas had disappeared into his study. The house was quiet again. That same quiet I had known since I was 6. But it no longer sat on my chest. It pressed against me, and I pressed back. I listened to every sound like a soldier memorizing a battlefield. The soft hum of the heating vents, the creak of wood near the staircase, the faraway clang of the buoy in the harbor outside. For the first time, I was not just surviving the silence. I was learning its shape. I was memorizing where it cracked. If they could turn silence into a weapon, so could I. At breakfast the next morning, Vivian behaved as if nothing had happened. She buttered her toast with the same clean movements, sipping coffee from her porcelain cup. Douglas read the paper at the head of the table, glasses sliding down his nose. My lips were raw. I kept my gaze down and ate quietly. She liked it when I was quiet. She smiled a little as if this was proof that her order had restored itself. She did not understand what she was looking at. She thought she had silenced me. She did not see that silence is not the same as surrender. I sat there counting the seconds between each clink of her spoon, timing the rhythm of this house. When Douglas asked about the trust again, I lowered my eyes and nodded softly. He smirked. Vivian looked pleased. She thought she had won. I let them believe that. It was the only way to start pulling the walls down without making a sound. That day, I walked through the house like a ghost. No resistance, no spark, no hint of the storm gathering inside me. I passed the sideboard where the silver tape still sat like a reminder, and I touched the wood with the tip of my finger. It was cool and smooth. I whispered to myself, not this time. Then I turned away and began to build my plan in the quiet they had given me. Later that afternoon, I walked into town with my coat collar pulled up against the wind. The harbor air carried the smell of salt and old wood. I told Vivian I needed a walk. She nodded like she believed me. She thought quiet meant obedience. It never occurred to her that silence could be strategy. I walked past the familiar stone walls of the historic district where every house looked like it had secrets trapped behind its windows. I turned down a side street and entered the small coffee shop where no one from their circle ever went. In the back corner, I pulled out my phone and opened the encrypted message from the lawyer I had met in New York. His reply was waiting. The trust transfer was complete. My name alone controlled it now. If they wanted to touch that money, they would have to walk through me. The thought steadied my breath. I sipped the coffee slowly and let the warmth spread through my chest. For years, my life had been built on their choices. Now I was building something else quietly. I walked back to the house just before sunset. The sky burned orange above the water. From the top of the hill, I could see the lighted windows of our home like watchful eyes. At dinner, Vivian asked where I had gone. I said for a walk. She did not press. Douglas watched me longer than she did. He was suspicious, but not enough to act. He believed fear still lived under my skin. I let him think that. After dinner, I went to my room and locked the door. My fingers trembled only once before they steadied around the small recorder I had hidden years ago. It was no bigger than a car key. I placed it inside the frame of the large painting in the dining room the next morning when no one was looking. The house had always listened to me. Now it would listen to them. For the first time in years, the silence around me was not just a wall. It was a shield. I whispered into the mirror, "You will not see me coming." The following days, I lived inside a script I wrote for them. Every morning, I sat at the breakfast table with my eyes lowered and my voice barely above a whisper. I answered their questions with yes, and I understand. Douglas liked to see obedience. Vivian liked to see stillness. They thought they were winning again. I learned the rhythm of their voices like a clock. I could predict when Douglas would speak first and when Vivian would tighten the strings behind him. I began to record everything. The house itself helped me. It was too quiet, so their voices carried through the dining room like polished knives. I kept my movements careful, steady, invisible. I slipped away in the afternoons to Boston on pretext of errands. I met with my lawyer in an office with tall windows that overlooked the Charles River. He explained how the trust structure I had built gave me legal ground no one else could step on. He did not ask why my hands shook slightly as I signed another stack of papers. I told him I wanted everything airtight. He nodded. I asked about safety measures. He said he could prepare something more secure. I agreed. I left his office with the wind blowing hard against my face. It felt cleaner than the air at home. Back at the house, I passed Douglas in the hallway. He smelled like expensive bourbon and control. He looked me up and down but said nothing. Vivian called after me from the sitting room, asking if I would join them for a dinner event with their friends next week. I said yes. She smiled because that was the answer she wanted. What she did not know was that the event would give me more ears to witness the truth. At night, I sat by the window in my room, looking out at the harbor lights flickering in the distance. Every light reminded me of the world beyond this house. The tape had shut my mouth, but it had not killed my mind. They thought they were watching me. They did not see that I was already 2 steps ahead. I whispered into the dark that every silence they forced would be turned against them. This time, the walls would not protect them. This time, the walls would speak. I started keeping a small notebook hidden behind a loose floorboard in my room. Every night after they went to sleep, I wrote down times, phrases, gestures. Vivian's tone when she spoke about control. Douglas's smirk whenever he reminded me what family meant. I documented it all, not because I needed to remember, but because I wanted to see their power stripped down to patterns on a page. When you look at cruelty long enough, it starts to lose its disguise. It becomes routine, predictable. That was how I would break them. On the 3rd night, I followed the sound of Douglas's steps to his study. I stood outside his door in the dark hallway and listened. He was on the phone, talking about how my inheritance would soon fund his next business deal. He did not whisper. He never imagined walls could betray him. The recorder inside the dining room was already working. Soon it would catch his voice saying the same things again at breakfast. Vivian would agree with him. She always did. I would have everything, one piece at a time. The next morning, she asked me to sign a document to allow Douglas access to the trust after my birthday. I pretended to hesitate like someone afraid. She smiled when I finally shook my head. She thought she had bent me without breaking me. She liked it that way. She believed it made her stronger. What she did not know was that my lawyer already had a copy of the original trust papers. Her document meant nothing. I placed the recorder on the mantel behind the clock. It was a perfect hiding spot. No one in this house ever touched the clock. It had been in the family for generations, just like the silence. That night, as I lay in bed, the wind pressed against the windows. I felt something inside me settle into place. For the first time, I did not feel small in this house. The walls still stood, the chandelier still hung. Vivian and Douglas still believed they owned me. But the house itself was already turning. They just did not hear it yet. By the end of that week, their routine felt like a map I could read with my eyes closed. Vivian woke at 6:30, poured coffee at 6:45, made a call to one of her charity boards at 7 sharp. Douglas went to his study by 8, called his partners by 8:15, left the house at 8:40 to make people believe he still ran his empire alone. They moved like a script that had been playing for years. I had never realized how predictable they were until I stopped being afraid. On Friday night, they hosted one of their regular gatherings with friends from the country club. They dressed the house in perfection. Chandeliers glowing, crystal glasses lined, waiters stepping carefully around the rugs. I wore the pale blue dress Vivian had chosen for me. She smiled as if I were a perfect prop. But under that dress taped against my skin was a small backup recorder. I walked through the rooms smiling at the guests and memorizing every inch of the scene. Vivian laughed too loudly at a joke someone told about inheritance battles. Douglas clinked glasses with a friend and said, "Money always finds its rightful place." I stored every word inside my head like a blade being sharpened. Later that night, after the guests left and the house fell back into its familiar cold, I slipped into the dining room alone. I stood where I had stood when he pressed the tape over my mouth. The chandelier flickered softly above me. I whispered, "You have no idea what is coming." My fingers brushed the frame where the recorder sat hidden, still capturing every whisper in this house. I took the small notebook from behind the floorboard and tucked it into my bag along with a set of copied documents my lawyer had given me. The pieces were ready. The only thing left was time. I looked around the room one last time at the perfect table and the polished floor. For years, this house had been their fortress. Soon it would be their stage, and I would be the one pulling the strings. I turned off the lights and let the darkness settle around me. The silence no longer felt like a cage. It felt like a weapon in my hands. The invitations went out 2 weeks before my 26th birthday. White envelopes with silver lettering, the kind Vivian always loved, printed with the words, "Private Celebration at Newport Country Club." She thought it was her idea. She told everyone it would be a beautiful night to announce how the family was entering a new chapter. She smiled when she said those words, and I smiled back because she did not see the blade underneath. Douglas spent those days walking through the house making calls about what he planned to do with the trust once it was officially his. He said things like expansion and investment. He said our name would be untouchable. He never said my name once. I moved through the house like a shadow. Every step had purpose. I worked with my lawyer quietly. He arranged for 2 additional guests to attend the party. One was an attorney specialized in trust law. The other was a journalist I had met through an old classmate in Boston. They were not on the printed guest list. Their presence would not be noticed until it was too late. I made sure of it. The night before the party, I stood alone in the dining room where everything had begun. The chandelier above me threw light across the polished floor. I could still hear the sound of the tape if I closed my eyes. But now the room felt different. I had built something in silence that they could not see. I whispered to the empty room tomorrow, "The silence ends." I slipped the backup recorder into the lining of my clutch. I wore the pale silk dress Vivian had picked out for me. She thought I would stand beside her as decoration. She did not know I would stand in front of her as the storm. The evening air over Newport carried that crisp edge that comes just before spring breaks the winter's hold. The club was glowing when I arrived, warm lights spilling through tall windows onto the manicured lawn. Inside the grand hall, chandeliers glittered over polished wood floors and long tables set with crystal and silver. Vivian greeted guests near the entrance like a queen hosting a coronation. Douglas stood beside her, one hand on her back, his other holding a drink, laughing too loudly with men who liked power. When I walked in, they both turned to me with matching smiles that never reached their eyes. Vivian said, "You look perfect," and brushed an imaginary crease from my shoulder. I said thank you softly the way she liked to hear it. Douglas clinked his glass against mine and told me tonight would change everything. I almost laughed because he was right, just not in the way he imagined. Guests moved through the hall in soft waves of perfume, laughter, and money. These were their people, the ones who believed in appearances more than truth. I let them see what they wanted to see. I let Vivian pull me into polite conversations. I let Douglas boast about family legacy. In the far corner near the side door, my lawyer and the journalist blended in with the crowd unnoticed. I caught my lawyer's subtle nod. Everything was ready. The audio system had been tested hours earlier under the guise of a music check. The file was loaded. All it needed was one signal. As the evening deepened, Douglas raised a glass at the center of the room and called for attention. Vivian stepped closer to him, her posture straight, her hand light on his arm. I stood to his right, smiling just enough. He began talking about family and unity and the future we were building. He said my name as if it were a possession. Every syllable rang like a chain against stone. The guests smiled and nodded. They believed him. They always believed the man with the microphone. But I had something louder, something true. When he handed the microphone to me, expecting me to echo his words, my fingers wrapped around it steadily. My silence had done its work. Tonight, it would speak. I stood at the center of the room with the microphone in my hand. For a second, all I heard was the faint hum of the chandelier lights above and the soft clinking of glasses settling back onto the tables. Dozens of faces turned toward me, polite, expectant, comfortable. Douglas gave me that smile he always used when he thought he had already won. Vivian watched me with a calm so polished it almost sparkled. She thought I would thank them. She thought I would say what she told me to say. I let the silence stretch until it felt like something alive crawling along the edges of the room. Then I smiled. Not the small, careful smile they trained me to use. A real one. I said, I want to thank everyone for coming. My voice was steady and clear. I said this house and this family have always valued silence, the kind of silence that keeps things perfect. I paused again, letting the words sink in. I looked at Vivian and Douglas and saw the first thin crack of unease behind their masks. I said, but silence can also tell the truth if you let it speak. That was the signal. My lawyer nodded once from the far side of the room. The soft background music died and the sound system picked up the first clip. The room filled with Douglas's voice. If she talks again, shut him up. Then the sharp rip of tape. It was so loud in that elegant room, it felt like it split the night open. Conversations died instantly. Someone gasped. I kept my gaze fixed on Vivian. Her fingers twitched against her clutch. Douglas stiffened but tried to keep the smile on his face. Then came her voice. If you can't shut her up, seal her like trash. The words poured through the speakers like cold water over fire. I saw the faces around us shift. A senator's wife lowered her champagne flute. One of Douglas's business partners stared at him as if seeing him for the first time. My heart beat steady in my chest. For years, their voices had lived inside these walls like shadows. Now they filled the air where everyone could hear them. It was no longer my burden to carry. It was theirs. The room froze in the kind of silence that has weight. No one moved. The only sound was the steady playback of their cruelty, clear and sharp through the speakers. Vivian's smile was gone now, stripped down to something brittle and pale. Douglas's jaw tightened. I watched his eyes flick across the room as if he could still control it, but the control was already slipping through his fingers. Someone in the back whispered something. Then came the sound of chairs shifting, the kind that happens when people realize they are standing next to something rotten. My lawyer stepped forward, calm and precise, introducing himself to the guests and reminding them that the trust was in my name alone. The journalist raised a phone, slightly not threatening, just recording. Douglas took one step toward me and stopped when he noticed that all eyes were on him. Vivian reached for his arm, but even her hand shook. For the first time, they looked small in a room they used to own. I lifted my chin and said, "This is the silence they taught me. Now it belongs to me." I let that line hang in the air. Then the lights hit them like a spotlight. The elegant club with its chandeliers and silver had become a courtroom without walls. Douglas tried to laugh it off to say it was taken out of context, but context was written on every face in the room. Vivian's oldest friend turned away from her without a word. Douglas's business partner set his drink down slowly and walked out. The quiet was heavier than the night. I stepped away from the microphone and let the recording finish. My lawyer moved closer to me, not to speak, just to stand on my side. Douglas looked at me like he finally understood what I had done. He had spent his life silencing me. He never imagined that silence could roar. That was the moment the power shifted. It didn't need a judge or a verdict. It was written in the faces of everyone who saw them for who they were. I walked past them toward the door without looking back. For the first time in that house of whispers, they had no voice. The morning after the party, the sun came up sharp and cold over Newport Harbor. The air felt different, thinner, as if the house itself had been holding its breath for years and finally exhaled. I sat at the kitchen table alone with a cup of coffee, watching the steam rise. For the first time, I did not hear Douglas's voice filling the halls or Vivian's heels clicking on the floor. It was quiet, but not the kind of quiet they used to own. This was mine. The doorbell rang at 8:30. I already knew who it was. 2 officers stood at the door with clipped professionalism, followed by an investigator from the state attorney's office. The audio from the party had traveled fast. Newport had always been a town built on appearances, and what happened last night tore a hole through the facade. The officers asked for Douglas Kane. I pointed to his study. He came out in a wrinkled shirt, still trying to hold himself like a man untouchable. But his face gave him away. The investigator read out the charges: assault and coercion tied to the evidence I had given them. He laughed at first, a low, bitter sound, the same sound I had heard when he thought nothing could touch him. Then the cuffs clicked shut. His expression shifted not rage, not disbelief, but something hollow. He was finally in a room where his voice didn't matter. Vivian followed them to the door in her silk robe, whispering his name, whispering mine. Her hair wasn't perfect this morning. She looked smaller. When the cruiser pulled away, the house fell silent again, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was clean. I took another sip of coffee and looked out toward the harbor. The wind blew hard against the windows. For years, they believed I would never stand against them. Now their walls were gone and the wind was mine. By noon, the news had spread through Newport like fire through dry grass. People who had spent years attending my mother's charity galas and Douglas's business dinners were now sharing the recording in quiet phone calls they thought no one could hear. By evening, it was already on local news sites. The headline read, "Heiress exposes family abuse at public event." The photo beneath it showed Vivian standing frozen in the middle of the country club ballroom while Douglas stared at the floor. I sat on the balcony of the house they once ruled and listened to the distant hum of the harbor. My phone buzzed constantly. Some messages came from people I had known for years, women who whispered their support but had never dared to speak before. Others were from reporters asking for statements. I gave none. The silence itself spoke louder than anything I could say. In the afternoon, my lawyer called to confirm that the legal transfer of the trust was finalized without any challenge. Douglas's access was permanently severed. Vivian's name was removed from the advisory board she had used to control every appearance of her life. Her friends stopped returning her calls. Her charity sponsors withdrew overnight. In this town, reputation is a currency more fragile than glass. Once cracked, it cannot be repaired. I walked through the house with my bare feet touching the cold wood floors. The portraits of ancestors hung in perfect rows as they always had, but they no longer looked like judges. They looked like witnesses. I passed the dining room where the chandelier cast soft yellow light on the table. For years, this room had been a stage for their control. Now it was just a room. I stopped at the sideboard where the roll of duct tape had once gleamed like a threat. It was gone. So were they. I touched the wood surface and felt nothing but its smoothness. No fear, no weight, just air. 3 days later, the headlines were no longer just local. The story had moved beyond Newport into state papers and then national feeds. Wealthy stepfather arrested after public exposure at Newport event. Beneath the headline was a still image of Douglas standing stiff while the officers led him away. The tape recordings had become more than gossip. They were evidence. The state attorney's office confirmed the charges and the investigation expanded into the family's finances. Douglas had spent years building his image on polished lies. It took one night to tear it down. Vivian tried to hold on longer. She walked through the streets in designer coats as if pretending nothing had changed would keep the truth from settling in. But people looked at her differently now. Neighbors who once waved turned their faces away. The charity board released a short statement the next morning thanking her for past service and announcing her removal. Her bank accounts tied to the family trust were frozen. Every move she had used to control me was falling apart like wet paper. I watched it all from a distance. I did not gloat. I just breathed. I walked down Bellevue Avenue without lowering my head for the first time in my life. The air tasted sharper, freer. A woman who used to smile tightly at my mother stopped me outside a cafe. She said she had been at the party. She whispered that what I did was brave. I looked at her and realized bravery did not feel loud. It felt quiet, steady, clean. I kept walking. The world they built on control was collapsing and I no longer had to hold its weight. The court hearing came faster than I expected. Newport was never kind to scandals that touched its wealthiest names, and this one was too loud to bury. Douglas stood in front of the judge in a suit that no longer fit the man he had pretended to be. The charges were read calmly: assault, coercion, financial manipulation. The audio played again in a room where he could not hide behind chandeliers or guests. His voice, echoing against courtroom walls, carried none of its old power. Vivian sat behind him wrapped in a dark coat, her hands clenched together. For years, she had commanded entire rooms with a glance. Now she avoided every pair of eyes. I sat quietly in the gallery with my lawyer beside me. I did not need to speak. My silence was louder than their defense. The judge denied bail. The press outside the courthouse swarmed, flashes exploding like a storm of light, but I kept walking with my head high. Vivian tried to approach me near the steps. She said my name like it might still work. It didn't. I kept walking past her. She had spent her life wrapping cruelty in silk and expecting the world to kneel. But Newport no longer bowed. Her friends had already stepped back. Her board seats were gone. Her world had shrunk to the sound of her own footsteps on cold pavement. I reached the harbor alone that night. The wind whipped through my hair, carrying the smell of salt and the sound of distant buoys. I breathed in deeply, and for the first time it didn't hurt. The silence I carried now wasn't theirs. It was mine. Clean, steady, final. The house on the hill was almost too quiet when I returned. The kind of quiet that used to suffocate me now settled like soft air on my skin. The iron gates opened with their familiar groan, but no one stood waiting at the door. No Douglas. No Vivian. Only the sound of the wind rolling in from the harbor. For years I had walked through these doors with my shoulders pulled tight, bracing for the weight of their voices. That night I stepped inside without flinching. The foyer smelled like polished oak and old perfume, but beneath it there was something new. Space. I walked through the hallway slowly, my heels echoing against the marble floor, and realized how big this house had always been. It wasn't the house that had been small. It was me who had been forced into corners. I passed the dining room where the chandelier still hung golden light spilling over the table. I remembered the night when the tape sealed my mouth and I thought silence would be the end of me. I stood in the same spot and listened. No one moved. No one commanded. The silence no longer pressed. It breathed with me. I walked to the sideboard where the tape had once gleamed and opened the drawer. Empty. It felt right. I closed it gently. Then I moved to the fireplace where Vivian had sat that night like a queen watching her kingdom bend. The chair was empty now. I lowered myself into it and leaned back. The fire crackled softly. The room that had once been a stage for fear was now just a room. My room. I whispered to the walls, "You don't own me anymore." The chandelier flickered like it had heard. I stayed there a long time, letting the silence settle until it felt like something alive and kind instead of sharp and cold. For the first time in my life, I understood what quiet was supposed to feel like. Not control, not fear. Peace. In the following weeks, the house changed with me. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I stripped away the pieces they used to control every corner. The heavy curtains Vivian loved came down first. Light poured in through the tall windows in a way I had never seen before. The portraits in the hallway stayed, but their power faded. They were no longer silent witnesses to cruelty. They were just paint and canvas hanging on a wall. I sold the dining chairs Douglas had chosen and replaced them with simple oak ones that creaked slightly when I sat down. I wanted to hear the sound of living things, not silence turned into a weapon. I started making coffee in the kitchen at sunrise barefoot, letting the cold tiles ground me. The harbor wind slipped through the half-open windows and carried the scent of salt into the house. It felt clean, real. I stopped moving through rooms like a guest. I moved like someone who belonged. One morning I walked into the dining room and sat at the head of the table where Douglas used to sit. For years, that spot had been a throne of control. I leaned back in the chair, sipped my coffee, and listened. No one barked orders. No one weighed me down. The chandelier hummed softly in the draft, and the sound reminded me of a heartbeat. My own. Outside, the world kept moving. People whispered about the scandal for a while, but even whispers eventually lost their shape. Newport had found new stories to chase. The house no longer echoed with their names. It only held mine. I spent afternoons sitting on the balcony facing the harbor, watching the boats drift. Sometimes I thought about the little girl who used to press her face against the window, wishing to leave. She hadn't been weak. She'd been waiting. I told her softly in my head that she could rest now. She didn't need to run anymore. The silence that once crushed her was now hers to shape. It had taken everything to get here, but I was here, and this time I wasn't going anywhere. Sometimes at night, I still walk through the house with the lights off. The floors remember the weight of footsteps that are no longer here. The walls remember their voices, but they no longer obey them. I trace my fingers along the cool surface of the hallway where Vivian used to glide in silk robes, where Douglas's shadow stretched long like a threat. Now it's just space, empty and mine. I stand at the foot of the staircase and listen to the wind pushing against the windows, steady and unafraid. I walk up slowly, passing the bedroom door that used to be theirs. It stands closed, not locked. It will never be locked again. I keep walking to my room at the end of the corridor. The window there faces the harbor. I open it wide enough to let the night rush in. The air tastes sharp with salt. I close my eyes and breathe it in like oxygen after being underwater too long. There are no footsteps behind me, no cold eyes watching from the firelight, no hands waiting to take my voice. I sit on the floor by the window, knees drawn up, and let the silence stretch. It no longer feels like something to survive. It feels like a friend who has waited for me to come home. Some nights I replay everything in my head, not because I can't move on, but because I want to remember what it took to get here. The tape, the choking quiet, the trembling rage. The plan. The moment their voices were dragged into the light. Those memories are not cages anymore. They are proof that silence can be broken, twisted, reforged into something stronger. I press my hand against my chest and feel my heart beat. For years, I had to fight to hear it beneath their noise. Now it fills the room on its own. I whisper into the dark, "I am not yours. I never was." The wind pushes against the curtains like it heard me. I don't flinch. I let it in. Spring arrived quietly over Newport. The harbor thawed from winter's grip and the sea breeze carried a softer touch. I spent the mornings walking down Bellevue Avenue with a light jacket, passing the same stone walls that once felt like the edges of a prison. Now they were just walls. I stopped at the cafe near the docks, the same one where I had read the lawyer's message months before. The barista had started greeting me by name. I sat near the window with a cup of black coffee and watched the boats rock gently on the water. People came and went talking about ordinary things. No one whispered about me anymore. Their eyes no longer carried that heavy mix of curiosity and judgment. They had moved on, and so had I. I returned to the house before noon. The sunlight hit the facade, and for the first time it didn't feel cold. I stepped inside without looking over my shoulder. Every sound was mine now. The creak of the stairs, the hum of the heater, the soft shift of wind through the half-open window. It was strange how the same sounds that once tightened my chest now made me breathe deeper. In the afternoon, I sat in the old study, the room Douglas had claimed as his territory. I opened the windows wide. The air flooded in, washing away the stale scent of bourbon and control that had lived there for years. On the shelves, there were still traces of him: books, papers, objects, but none of them could speak anymore. I sat behind the desk, ran my fingertips over the wood, and closed my eyes. I remembered every moment I had stood outside this door, afraid to make a sound. That fear was gone now. What remained was something quieter, stronger, deeper. I whispered into the empty room, "This is mine now." The breeze carried my voice out to the harbor. It didn't need to roar. It didn't need to echo. It just needed to exist. And that was enough. The night I decided to stay alone in the house without locking a single door was the night everything finally settled. The sky outside was deep and cloudless, the harbor lights blinking like distant signals that no longer called me away, but invited me to rest. I walked barefoot through the downstairs hallway, every step whispering against the old floorboards that had carried so many years of fear. Now they sounded different, lighter. I poured myself a glass of water in the kitchen and stood by the window watching the reflection of the moon stretch across the black water. For years, this house had been a fortress built to keep me contained. Tonight, it felt like a shell that had finally cracked open. I went to the fireplace and sat in the chair Vivian once claimed as her throne. The flames moved softly, painting the walls gold. I leaned back, feeling the warmth on my face, listening to nothing but the quiet. It wasn't sharp or heavy anymore. It was steady, like a heartbeat. I thought about all the nights when silence had been my enemy, when it filled my lungs until breathing hurt. I thought about the tape, about the cold look in their eyes, about the way I believed my voice would never matter. But it did. It mattered enough to break the world they built. Outside, the wind rose for a moment and the chandelier above me trembled lightly. Instead of fear, it felt like an answer. I tilted my head back and closed my eyes. I didn't need applause or revenge or noise to fill the space they left. I needed this, a house that no longer owned me, a silence that no longer hurt. I whispered into the room, "You can rest now." The words were for the walls, for the girl I had been, for the voice they tried to bury. The wind slipped through the window, soft and cool, like it had been waiting all along. For the first time, the quiet didn't ask me to hide. It asked me to live. I sat there in the quiet, my hands resting on the armrests of the chair, the fire casting warm light against the walls, and realized something I never could have believed a year ago. Silence isn't always the enemy. It's the people who use it like a weapon who make it dangerous. Tonight, the silence belonged to me. For a long time, I thought stories like mine stayed locked behind doors, hidden beneath polished floors and chandeliers. But the truth is, every time someone speaks or even breathes through the weight of it, another wall begins to crack. If you've ever been forced into quiet, you know that silence is not just the absence of sound. It's a pressure that can live in your lungs and behind your eyes until you can't tell where it ends and where you begin. I know what it feels like to live in that kind of quiet. I know what it feels like to lose your voice and wonder if you'll ever get it back. If this story has touched something in you, if you've ever stood in a room where the air itself felt like a hand pressed against your mouth, then you understand what I mean. This part is for you. Don't let anyone convince you your voice isn't worth hearing. Don't let anyone turn your silence into their control. You may not be ready to roar. You may not even be ready to whisper. But even the smallest breath against their power is a beginning. A beginning is enough. If you've ever lived through a silence like this, let me know you're out there. Leave a single word or even a single mark. Not for me, but for you. To claim your space back, even if it's just a corner of a comment box. Sometimes that's where it starts. One small sound in a quiet room. One spark in the dark. If you are reading this or listening to these words, and part of you still carries that quiet around like a weight, I want you to know something simple but real. You are not weak for surviving. People who have never been trapped inside silence don't understand what it costs to keep breathing when the world tells you your voice has no value. But I do. Every heartbeat inside a quiet room is proof of strength. Every small step toward reclaiming your space is resistance. You don't have to fight with a roar to matter. You just have to keep existing where they told you not to. That's where it begins. I used to think the night would always belong to them. Now I know the night can hold your breath and still give it back to you when you're ready. If you've been through something like this, you don't have to explain every detail. You don't owe the world your pain. You owe yourself the right to stand again. So if you've ever lived in a house that told you to be quiet, if you've ever had someone look at you like your voice didn't belong to you, if you've ever stared at a door and thought no one would hear you if you opened it, I want you to remember this moment. You are not alone in that silence. There are thousands of us who learned how to breathe again, slowly, painfully, but surely. Leave a mark here. One word, one dot, one sign that you're still standing. Because every single mark is another wall cracking somewhere else. That's how silence loses. Not through explosions, through persistence, through people who refuse to disappear. I know what it's like to feel like the world moves around you while you're trapped in stillness. To sit in a room where no one hears your heartbeat but you. To think maybe this is how it will always be. But it isn't. The truth is that silence is not permanent. It only stays when people like them convince you that it belongs to them. But it doesn't. It never did. It belongs to you. It's yours to keep, or to break, or to fill with your voice when you're ready. For a long time, I didn't believe I had the right to claim it. Then one night, the tape came off and I realized they had never owned my silence. They only borrowed it, and like everything they took, it could be taken back. If you are somewhere right now sitting in a quiet that doesn't feel safe, I want you to hear this. It isn't forever. It might not end loudly. It might not end the way stories and movies do. But it can end slowly and powerfully when you begin to breathe for yourself again. If you've felt that if you've lived it, I want you to speak, or breathe, or simply leave one mark here that says, I'm still here. Because you are. And that matters. This story isn't just mine. It belongs to anyone who has ever felt the weight of silence pressing down on them. So, wherever you are, whoever you are, if you've carried that weight and survived it, your voice belongs in this space too. Let it out, even if it's just a whisper. A whisper is still a beginning. Before this story ends, I want you to remember something that took me years to learn. When they silence you, it's never about your voice being too small. It's about them fearing what happens when that voice is finally heard. People who use silence as a weapon are terrified of the day it turns into power. Mine did. Yours can too. It doesn't matter if your story is whispered or shouted, written down in a hidden notebook, or spoken in front of 1,000 people. What matters is that it exists, that it breathes, that it refuses to be buried. If you've carried silence for too long, tonight can be the moment you set it down. Not to erase what happened, but to stop letting it own you. If this story stirred something in you, don't hold it inside. Say something. Leave a dot, a word, a sentence. Anything that is yours. Because every time someone speaks from that quiet, the world tilts a little. The control they thought they had slips further away. That is how silence turns from a cage into a storm. That is how ordinary people break unshakable walls. If you've ever stood in the dark waiting for someone to hear you hear this instead, I do. We do. And there are so many others waiting to see your mark and know they are not alone. Let this be the place where silence ends and your voice begins.